Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and why they are so important. My guest today is the creator of these goals and an expert on this topic. Paula Caballero is a regional managing director for Latin America at the Nature Conservancy. Previously, Ms. Caballero was the senior director of the World Bank Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice. Her recent book is Redefining Development, the Extraordinary Genesis of the Sustainable Development Goals. Paula Caballero, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to join you.
I appreciate you being with me. Before we get into the Sustainable Development Goals, commonly called the SDGs, let's talk about the Nature Conservancy. Very briefly, what is it? What does it do?
The Nature Conservancy is the world's largest environmental organization. We work in over 79 countries, and we've been working in this field for over 70 years. I'm very proud to say, though, that the Nature Conservancy is not just about a narrow version of environment, but we really demonstrate that we work for nature and people thriving. So we are writ large about creating very long-lasting win-win solutions around areas of sustainable development. It's durable protection where everybody, nature and people thrive.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to your website at www.nature.org to get more information. So let's jump into the Sustainable Development Goals and talk about them. Of course, we think back to 2015, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the UN General Assembly. They were on a timeline of from 2016 to basically 2030. And of course, COVID threw a curveball at us a bit. But let's go back before that and talk about why these, well, a little bit about the development of the Sustainable Development Goals and why they're so transactional and so important to us today and will be in the future.
Well, I think the SDGs were transformational because they really redefined development. That's why that's the title of the book. The book covers the period from end of 2010, beginning 2011, through to 2012, which is when Colombia created this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals and got the whole world to agree to both that vision of the Sustainable Development Goals and to a very revolutionary format within the UN, which enabled us, after this great Earth Summit that took place in the year 2012, to actually craft the SDGs as we know them today. My main message, and the reason I'm so delighted to join you today, is because the reason we wrote the book and the reason I'm with you today is to share a simple message, and that is that the SDGs were not inevitable. They were not a natural evolution within the UN processes. When we proposed the SDGs, we met such vehement opposition that we never could have possibly have expected. And the reason for that is simple. At the turn of the century, the UN created something called the Millennium Development Goals. And they were great because when you have a metric, when you have targets and indicators, it gives everybody a reference that you can galvanize around. And that's what these MDGs or Millennium Development Goals did. They created a global undertaking. We're going to eradicate poverty. We're going to deal with things like malaria or infant mortality. Wonderful. When I came into the Colombian government in 2010 and thought about what would be the agenda for this great event that was looming in the horizon in 2012, which was going to be at the level of heads of state, I thought that the MDGs had been great because it was a metric that galvanized, it was a reference, but they were insufficient because you can't end poverty by wishing that you're going to end poverty or end hunger. And the MDGs were very divisive and very narrow. Let me explain why. They divided the world into developed and developing. So everybody, it was the developing countries that had to act and develop more different development pathways, if you will. And the developed countries only had a responsibility to provide resources or technology or other types of capacity. So when the SDGs idea came up, it was very revolutionary because it was predicated on several things. One, that we needed a universal agenda, that all countries have development issues. They might be in different places along the spectrum, but if it's Belgium or Botswana, there's different development issues that have to be tackled. Nobody sort of has it fixed for the future. The second is that there are all these global common issues, whether it's biodiversity loss or climate change or immigration flows or illegal trade flows, intellectual property, you name it. All of it means that we work in a globalized world. And for that, we need a common shared framework, not one that divides the world. But now that seems pretty obvious, right? Of course. But back then it wasn't, because what the status quo looked like was the MDGs, a few goals, socially oriented, that only had responsibilities for developing countries. So there was a big backlash. And the other backlash was people thought I was generally crazy to suggest an agenda that covered the whole of development. Everybody thought that would be just a piñata, an unworkable mess, because there were too many issues. And my point was, you can't end hunger, and ending hunger is like the end of the pipe. You need to transform global food systems so that everybody has access to adequate and nutritious food. Ending hunger is just sort of ticking a box. Changing food systems and access to food in a predictable and constant way, that's a different undertaking, and that's what we need. So I raised the level and the ambition of what, as a global society, we needed to do with the SDGs. And there was a lot of opposition, even to the point that many people said to me and to Colombia that we didn't care about poverty because we were undermining and creating conditionalities for developing countries, when the opposite was true. And so the book details the history of how, through really, I was a diplomat. I was an official government of Colombia. But what we really did from within Colombia was working through what I would call informal diplomacy. We broke the rules. We didn't just follow the processes. And the end result was that we were able, against all odds, because, for example, the Rio +20 agenda was already set in stone. It couldn't be changed. It had been agreed by all the countries at the General Assembly with a resolution. And I was informed, you are crazy. You cannot put in a new agenda item because this is cast in stone. I said, well, we'll see. And we'll see is that the SDGs became a part of the agenda and really became, if you look back to what happened in 2012 and Rio +20, the decisive factor, what has since shifted the entire reality of how we understand development, is not everything that was in that big political declaration. It was the 9 paragraphs, more or less, about the SDGs that were transformative. And so the book tells the story. And I think it's an important story, Bill, because today, when we look at these poly-crises, it's not just the biodiversity and climate, but the growing inequity, for example. When we look at these interlinked crises, we need to really look to the vision and the understanding with which the SDGs were imagined, created, negotiated, so that with that same level of ambition, of innovation, of a willingness to disrupt, we think about how to implement these SDGs. It's not a question of ticking boxes of one target or another target. The question we need to ask ourselves as a global society is the same question I asked about hunger. Are we just trying to tick a box and, do a little bit of food aid here and there? Or are we trying to change the whole global system? And that goes for energy, it goes for transportation, it goes for education, and it goes for the interlinkages between these. That's what we need. That's what the SDGs are calling for. And my invitation, the reason that my co-author, Patti Londoño, and I wrote this book, is to share with the world that vision so we don't take the SDGs for granted, but realize that they were almost miraculous, how revolutionary they are, and that there are an invitation, an incitement, if you will, for action in this planetary inflection point that we're at, so that we act at the scale and with the ambition and with the urgency that this poly-crisis demands of us as a human species.
They certainly are, and they are totally, well, I would say totally different, but quite dramatically different from the Millennium Development Goals. And we're going to come back and talk about them in just a minute. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at the creation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Paula Caballero is the Regional Managing Director for Latin America at the Nature Conservancy. She is also the co-author of a book called Redefining Development, the Extraordinary Genesis of the Sustainable Development Goals. Paula, you were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and you're right, they were applicable to everybody, as opposed to, I think, 8 Millennium Development Goals. You have 17 Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, to abolish hunger, to empower women, to confront climate change, and 13 more very laudable goals. And they were ones that the world has gotten behind, I think, to a large degree. And many people are working to achieve these goals, but they're not aware that they're part of the United Nations, or that they were developed by you and the United Nations folks to move forward and to help create this better world. Have you seen that change a bit over the years? Are people beginning to realize that they did come through a very, very rigorous system, to put it mildly?
Well, I think that the development goals of the SDGs were a watershed and are a watershed for a lot of reasons. One is that they have created a common language with which we can talk about the complexity of development. Whether you're a mayor, whether you're a big corporate CEO, whether you are in the UN, whether you're in government or academia, the SDGs have become a shorthand for the complexity of development. And that little circle with all the little colored slices to it that represent the SDGs is a lingua franca, if you will. It's a common grammar that we use to refer to the SDGs. It has also very importantly helped galvanize all sorts of different constituencies and stakeholders. For example, for the corporate sector, and corporate sector was a big champion of the work that I was undertaking with Patti Londoño when we were in the Colombian government to implement the to get agreement on the SDGs, because they were seeing something coming out of the UN finally that they could really wrap their businesses and their heads around, and that was relevant for their business models. So, for example, the ESG frameworks, the environment, social governance frameworks that are the roadmaps for greater sustainability in the corporate and industrial sector and the financial sector, most of these ESG frameworks have the SDGs as a backbone. So it has helped galvanize greater sustainability and alignment across the corporate sector through the SDGs with these new environment, social, and governance frameworks. For governments also, it has become a way to integrate really multi-sectoral and multi-dimensional approaches to very complex issues. So, for example, poverty, you have multi-dimensional poverty indices where you're not looking only at income inequality, but you're looking at a whole range of issues that influence on the well-being of a person, right? Access to transportation, health, etc. When you're looking at very and dramatically pertinent issues like water use, water shortage, efficiency in water use, we're looking right now at droughts around the world, declining agricultural outputs and productivity, really huge and very prevalent issues. I mean, the impacts of climate change are being felt now. The SDGs can help a government address issues around water management and water use with the integrated, coordinated way that is required to really be able to manage this very precious resource in a way that makes sense. So the SDGs are a very useful tool conceptually. They are a very useful tool for planning purposes for both governments as well as industry and other stakeholders. and they can galvanize civil society to understand issues and to bring their muscle, their vision, their voice around a lot of issues that require that kind of a collective undertaking. What my big request, though, to the world is two. One, again, that we don't look at the SDGs and look at individual targets and tick them off. I get asked a lot, Bill, how are we doing on SDG implementation, as though each little target, and it's not. If you look at an issue like land degradation, that's not an environmental issue. That is going to hit on economic well-being, it's going to hit on agricultural productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So what we need to do is look at the interrelations, the systems around these targets, and ask ourselves, are we understanding and creating integrated solutions, systems solutions that address them differently? And the other really big problem we might have in the years ahead is that we're going to get to the point where they say, oh, it's 2030, we haven't completed them, we haven't ticked all the boxes, let's renegotiate. We're never, ever, Bill, going to renegotiate or to arrive at a more comprehensive and ambitious framework than we have with the SDGs right now. If you read the book, you'll realize what a battle that was, how improbable it is that we got what we got. And so we cannot fall into the trap. The other trap that's related to 2030 is that we all say that we have until 2030. So that gives us comfort. And what that is really, Bill, is an invitation to just sit back, relax, and not take charge and not accept what's happening. Mm-hmm. I have told my team, we've made t-shirts that say 2030 is now, because the kind of solutions that call for transforming finance, that call for transforming markets, policy, practices, mindsets, that takes a long time. So to implement the SDGs, we have to get into the mindset that 2030 is now. And it's now when we have to think of those radical transformative solutions that bring together, that find win-wins of environment and economics and society. What are those win-wins? And we start to put those enabling conditions in place right now.
Exactly. And for our viewers who maybe have not seen the SDGs, you can buy Paula's book or just Google Sustainable Development Goals. And there are so many different levels of involvement for each of the 17 goals that it really goes into great detail. And it's really a remarkable blueprint on how to be successful in every one of these areas. Paula, you were talking about a new theme in 2030. My suggestion would be 2030, just the beginning. Now we start. That's where we would go. But the clock is not our friend today. I can see that right now. But let me ask you, what do you see as some of the major obstacles, but successes too, between now and 2030 and beyond, as you look into the crystal ball, not identifying each sustainable development goal, but just in general as we move forward on this very comprehensive developmental plan?
I think the real issue, the obstacle, the bottleneck is mindsets. If we, Einstein said it, we do the same thing over and over and expect different responses. And you mentioned COVID. COVID is a huge wasted crisis. COVID showed us the level and the depths of disruption that is needed. That kind of disruption is what we need. But it also is incredibly encouraging because it showed us the resilience that we have as a species globally to bounce back. We didn't bounce back as we said we would, green recovery and all of that. That fell through. We missed that opportunity. But COVID showed us what disruption looked like and should give us the courage, the heart to realize that we can engineer disruption and rupture of the scale that's needed, and that we will be able to come out stronger and the better for it. The biggest problem with the SDGs is that we think that we can just simply go ahead and implement them by ticking little boxes and taking little marginal incremental changes. I call that manicuring systems. We just sort of manicure around the edges, and these big systems are there. The systems right now that drive unsustainable practices, production, consumption, those systems are very much in place and they're entrenched. And we cannot pretend or hope to change them by doing independent or individual projects or small actions. We have to really look at how we shift the whole system, because otherwise we push back on a few areas or aspects of those systems, but those systems are incredibly resilient. And that's why nothing changes. And that's why, despite the enormous efforts that have been done to improve the well-being of people and the well-being of the nature on which our lives and our economies depend, so many of the indicators are still trending downwards because we have to find systemic solutions. And that's what I would highlight about the work at the Nature Conservancy. We are working at a systems level. We're working at sectors level. So for example, with cattle ranching, we don't just work with individual or with groups of producers or ranchers to help them be more sustainable. That's a part of it. But we're also changing the policy, the access to finance, the traceability, so that we can change how the entire sector works in a way that makes sense and is good for those ranchers, but is effectively addressing the main driver of deforestation in Latin America. So it's a win-win. Nature wins, producers wins, the market wins. That's the kind of solution that TNC is so good at engineering, at convening, and we don't do it alone. The other call of the SDGs is very much at the DNA of the Nature Conservancy, radical collaboration. It took a village, as you will see in the book, to get the SDGs to become a reality. It takes a village, a coordinated, integrated, ambitious village to implement them how they were meant to be implemented.
And that is so true. And we have to take a macro approach to dealing with these problems. We're living on a planet of blue marble, and all of the systems are interrelated in some way, shape, or form. And you just putting a Band-Aid on a problem is not going to solve the problem. You have to go to the root cause and then see what some of the ancillary causes or other tie-ins may be to help us overcome that. Well, Paula, we're just about out of time. In the last 30 seconds, what would be your message to the people around the world to motivate them to get involved in the Sustainable Development Goals?
When we proposed this, we got asked a lot, why Colombia? As in, why a nondescript middle-income country that doesn't really have a global voice? How dare you imagine that you can change the global agenda? And yet we did. And basically, it was started out with 2 women, and then we started to build a movement, and we got a lot of great people to support this. So my message is be ambitious, be disruptive, help implement the SDGs. And our story, the story in that book, is a proof that anybody and everybody can make a huge difference in the world if you have a vision and if you persevere. So the message is persevere and make a difference. I'll leave you with a quote from Nelson Mandela. It's impossible until it happens. Well, my invitation to you is make it happen.
Make it happen. And goal number 5, as I recall, is to empower women and girls. And apparently, even before the SDGs were created, it empowered you and your colleagues to move forward on this. But Paula Caballero, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me, Bill, and best of luck in supporting the SDGs.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.